Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Science on the Edge podcast. I'm Dr. Mike Darcy, and in today's episode, we're going to be discussing the biological basis of behavior. So I'm going to be giving a little neuroscience. I'm going to be talking a bit about neurotransmitters. I'll be covering addiction. I'll be talking a bit about phobias as well. So let's get started. Okay, so let's get started by talking a little bit about the neuron. So here's a neuron. We have many billions of these things in our body, and neurons basically transmit electricity. So electricity goes from dendrite right down the axon to the axon terminal. And then if the signal is to be transmitted from that neuron to another neuron, a neurotransmitter is released from the end, travels across the synaptic space and binds to the next neuron, where it can then stimulate the next neuron to fire or inhibit the next neuron. And this series of connections throughout the brain, throughout the spinal cord, throughout the body, allows our bodies to move, allows our brains to think, allows our emotions to occur. Okay, so parts of a neuron, just a brief summary of the neuron itself before we get into a bit more detail. So the cell body, this is basically it's where the biochemistry of the cell takes place in the molecular biology. It's where all the organelles are. It's where the DNA is. We have the dendrites. These are branching extensions at the end of the cell body. They receive messages from other neurons. We have the axon, a long single extension of a neuron covered with myelin. Myelin is kind of like an insulator, like the plastic around a wire. It basically stops the electrical signal from dissipating as it moves along a neuron. Basically, it speeds up the transmission rate. Then we have the terminal branches of the axon, branched endings of an axon that transmit messages to other neurons. Action potential. This is the electrical signal going down a neuron from the dendrite right down to the axon terminals. So a neural impulse, a brief electrical charge that travels down an axon and is generated by the movement of positively charged atoms in and out of channels in the axon's membrane. Basically, a neuron has what we call a resting potential, a resting electrical charge of minus 70 millivolts. So it's negative inside compared with the more positive charge outside the neuron. When a neuron actually fires, though, this charge changes. So what happens is little channels open in the neuron. Sodium, which is positively charged, is allowed into the neuron, which then changes the electrical potential of the neuron. Basically, as these channels open, an electrical signal moves along the neuron from one end to the other. Threshold. Each neuron receives excitatory and inhibitory signals from other neurons. When the excitatory signals minus the inhibitory signals exceed a minimum intensity, a threshold, the neuron fires an action potential. So basically, think of a neuron as being connected to many other neurons. So one neuron in your brain may be connected to thousands of others. Some might be trying to stimulate that neuron. Some might be trying to inhibit it. If a certain number are stimulating more than are inhibiting, then typically what happens is this stimulates that neuron to itself fire. So action potential properties, it's an all or none response. So a strong stimulus can trigger more neurons to fire and to fire more often, but it does not affect the action potential's strength or speed. Intensity of an action potential remains the same throughout the length of the axon. The synapse, this is the gap between one neuron and the next neuron. It's a junction between the axon tip of a sending neuron and the dendrite or cell body of the receiving neuron. Neurotransmitter travels through this gap. Neurotransmitters are chemicals released from the sending neuron or the presynapse. They travel across the synapse and bind to the receptor sites on the receiving neuron, the postsynaptic neuron. thereby influence it to generate its own action potential. So they're little chemicals. They are stored in sacs in the neuron known as vesicles, and an electrical signal moves from one end of the neuron to the other. It causes these vesicles to fuse with the membrane of the neuron and release the neurotransmitter. So neurotransmitters are basically chemical messengers that travel across the synapse from one neuron to the next. They can influence whether the second neuron will generate an action potential or not. Researchers have discovered many substances known to function as neurotransmitters. We're just going to talk about a handful of them here, but there are many, and there's probably a lot we still haven't discovered. They help to promote sleep, alertness, learning, memory of motivation, and emotions. They can also influence or cause psychological disorders, including depression and schizophrenia. Reuptake. Obviously, the neurotransmitters can't just hang around forever. So neurotransmitters in the synapse are reabsorbed into the sending neurons through the process of reuptake. This process applies the brakes on neurotransmitter action. Basically, the neurotransmitters are broken down, taken back up, recycled, ready for release again. Many drugs, by the way, to treat various psychological conditions interfere with this process. For example, SSRIs are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. These are drugs which stop the serotonin from being taken back up and therefore allow it to accumulate in the synapse, which means it can continue to stimulate the destination neuron. I'll explain a little bit more about serotonin shortly. So how neurotransmitters influence us. Serotonin pathways, for example, are involved with mood regulation. Dopamine pathways are involved with diseases such as schizophrenia and Parkinson's disease and addiction. So let's go through some examples. We'll briefly overview them, then go into more detail. Acetylcholine. So acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter that's involved in muscle movement and memory. Serotonin is involved in mood and sleep, also depression. Dopamine involved in movement and reward systems. Schizophrenia, Parkinson's are both caused by problems with dopamine. Too much, schizophrenia; too little, Parkinson's disease. So with serotonin. With serotonin, if you have a lot of serotonin, you feel quite happy. You have quite low amounts of serotonin, you feel quite depressed. GABA, gamma aminobutyric acid. It's an inhibitory neurotransmitter. It calms down your body, calms down your brain. So we don't just need neurotransmitters to stimulate us, we need it to calm us down as well. So GABA is necessary to keep the brain calm. If you don't produce enough GABA, you have difficulties calming down. Norepinephrine involved in arousal, mood, and the sympathetic nervous system's activation, stimulating heart rate to increase, for example, and breathing to increase, that kind of thing. So norepinephrine, very similar to adrenaline in that way. Activation, defects in norepinephrine levels can result in bipolar disorder. Opioids involved in pathways that reduce pain. So our brain produces its own opioids that keep our brain, keep us from feeling too much pain, basically. We have our own painkillers. The brain's natural opioids are released, for example, when we exercise. Exercise hurts. So let's break this down into more detail. Here's some neurotransmitters and their functions. So let's break this down. Acetylcholine. Function: enables muscle action, learning, and memory. Examples of malfunctions of acetylcholine are Alzheimer's disease. Basically, the acetylcholine producing neurons begin to deteriorate. So this results in a loss of memory and also problems with movement eventually. Dopamine. Function influences movement, learning, attention, and emotion. Excess dopamine receptor activity is linked to schizophrenia. Starved of dopamine, the brain produces the tremors and decreased mobility of Parkinson's disease. If you have too much dopamine, you can have all sorts of problems such as schizophrenia, but a little bit too much dopamine, just slightly higher levels, tends to make you a little bit more creative, a little bit more motivated. It's a sort of scale. Too little, Parkinson's disease, you can't motivate yourself, you can't move even very well. Too much, schizophrenia, but a little bit more than normal, and you may be quite creative, you might be quite driven. Serotonin affects the mood, hunger, sleep, and arousal. Undersupply is linked to depression. Prozac and some other SSRI drugs and antidepressant drugs raise serotonin levels, quite often by preventing its reuptake. Norepinephrine helps control alertness and arousal, and undersupply can depress the mood. GABA, a major inhibitory neurotransmitter, undersupply linked to seizures, tremors, and insomnia. Glutamate, a major excitatory neurotransmitter involved in memory. Oversupply can overstimulate the brain, producing migraines or seizures, which is why some people avoid MSG, monosodium glutamate, in food, because it can overstimulate. It can overstimulate the brain, cause migraines, cause seizures, that kind of thing. So locks and keys. Neurotransmitter molecules have special shapes. Receptor molecules have binding sites. When a neurotransmitter binds to the receptor, ions can enter that neuron. And this can basically then cause the next neuron to become active. So neurotransmitters combine within and, neurons combine within and between cell communication. So there are excitatory postsynaptic potentials. These binds at the receptor and makes the neuron more positive. Inhibitory postsynaptic potentials binds at receptor and makes the neuron more negative. So basically what's happening is neurotransmitters, when they bind to a neuron, can basically change the potential of the neuron. They can make the neuron itself more positively charged or more negatively charged. Remember, it's when the neuron is not firing, it's negative, it's minus 70 millivolts. So if you make it more negative, it's harder for that neuron to fire, so you calm down that neuron's activity. If you make it more positive, it's more likely to fire. So you're basically making it more likely that it will fire and stimulate your nervous system. Neurotransmitters, so an agonist mimics the action of a neurotransmitter. So some drugs, some compounds can basically act like a neurotransmitter, bind to the same receptors and stimulate neurons to fire. Some drugs act as antagonists. They oppose the action of a neurotransmitter and block its effect. Many drugs act as agonists or antagonists on neurons. Endorphins elevate the pleasure, mood, and reduce pain. They act by either increasing or decreasing specific neurotransmitter activity. They mimic effects of opium-based drugs like morphine. We won't talk about curare at the moment. That's a paralyzing poison, which again works by basically changing the activity of neurons. So let's talk about genetics first of all. So heredity, transmission of a trait from one generation to the next. We all have chromosomes, pairs of chromosomes, in fact, one set from our mother, one set from our father. So we have two sets of all of our genes, and we can have slightly different alleles of those genes, different variants of those genes. Now our genetics has an effect on our mood and our behavior and even our propensity to addiction. Because different varieties of genes, different alleles of genes can result in greater or lesser levels of certain neurotransmitters or the receptors that they bind to. And as a result of this, we can be more or less prone to certain psychological conditions and more or less prone to addiction. I mean, basically, if you take alcohol and you don't get a feeling of pleasure from it, as many people don't, then you're unlikely to become addicted to it. If you get a heightened amount of pleasure from it, you're more likely to get addicted to it. And this depends on your genetics. Behavioral genetics, the study of behavior from a genetic perspective. There are animal behavior genetic studies where we look at certain strains of animals with different variants of various genes, and we see how those variants affect behavior, affect mood, and we can then use that knowledge when we're looking in a clinical setting at humans. So when we can look at humans directly, so there are family studies. So we can take families and we can look at their behaviors, and we can then try and disentangle which of the behaviors are due to upbringing, environment, and which are genetic. Best way to look at genetics is really to look at closely related people, such as twins, that have been separated and brought up in separate families, because then you can untie, to a certain extent, environmental influences from genetic influences on behavior. So adoption studies. This is quite a lot of studies that are based on adoption records. So you look at people that have been adopted at a very early age, and you compare their behaviors with the adopted families and with the genetic families, the biological families, and try and disentangle everything. Molecular genetics is when you directly study the genetic code. So evolutionary psychology, this is sort of study of why certain behaviors evolved in the first place, why addiction occurs, why love occurs, why hate occurs, all of these things. It's all down to survival of the fittest, natural selection, traits which helped our ancestors to survive long enough to reproduce were passed on to the next generation. This is one of the reasons why certain fears exist. We are afraid of certain things because people that weren't afraid of those things in the past tended not to survive. So evolutionary psychology looks at the adaptive or survival value of certain behaviors. Now, there are social implications when we look at all of this sort of thing. So when we actually find genetic bases for aggression or for memory or all these things, when we basically find certain genes involved with behaviors, homosexuality being a certain example, then there are social implications. One might be genocide. Sounds a little bit over the top, but this is a fear. When scientists study the genetic basis of certain behaviors and they look at genes and they find certain alleles that are linked with aggression or linked with homosexuality or whatever, then the fear is that certain groups will use that knowledge to control people, to say, oh, this person shouldn't be allowed to reproduce because they carry this gene, or this person is inferior from this person because they carry this gene variant. Also, if this knowledge becomes widespread, so if we all end up getting our genomes sequenced in the future, which is very likely, and if that knowledge is not kept secure, then it could be that everyone has access to everyone's genome. So maybe the health system, health insurance, things like that would have access to our genome. And that knowledge could be used to determine what kind of insurance we get, what kind of jobs we get or are allowed to do. And this could basically produce a new class system. So we have to be very careful. By the way, this is no reason to not do the studies. A lot of scientists that try to find a genetic basis for certain behaviors and certain traits, a lot of these scientists are called racists or Nazis or whatever, just for even looking. but they're not. They're just trying to find the science. Science is useful. Science can help us. It doesn't have to result in political decisions being made. Okay, so now let's look in a little detail about how the reward system works in our brains. This is where we're going to touch on addiction. So we have different sections of our brain which are responsible for different tasks. Sensations, movement, vision, memory, reward, all of these things. And neurotransmitters in those areas influence those behaviors. So, for example, dopamine. Dopamine levels elevate when we enjoy food or when we have sex. As you can see from these charts, dopamine levels go up during these processes. So dopamine is a feel-good neurotransmitter. It's what gives us pleasure from certain behaviors, from food, from alcohol, from certain drugs, from behaviors we enjoy. It's the dopamine that's giving us those feelings. And it's the dopamine that's making us want to go back for more. Remember those feelings. So we can activate the pleasure centers of our brain, regions that produce neurotransmitters such as dopamine, with certain drugs. Certain drugs can stimulate these pathways, overstimulate these pathways, and this can lead to addiction. So here's a few drugs. So methamphetamine, cocaine, nicotine, and ethanol, or alcohol, we should say. And you can see the effects. So here we've got a part of the brain called the accumbens, which is deep in the brain. Now, this particular region of the brain is stimulated to quite a high level by certain drugs. And it's stimulated by the production of dopamine. And dopamine basically rises to a very high level with methamphetamine, to a pretty high level with cocaine, a moderately high level with nicotine, and a slight increase with ethanol. They all increase dopamine levels. In case you're wondering about this key here, DA, DOPAC, and HVA. DOPAC and HVA are just metabolites of dopamine as it's broken down, basically. So why can't people just stop drug use? Well, when people first try drugs, it's usually a voluntary decision, but after using the drug for a while, it can become no longer voluntary. Basically, you become addicted because those pathways become overstimulated and they become dependent on that stimulation. So when they're not stimulated, we get withdrawal. For example, with tobacco, the brain responds to all this nicotine that's flooding it by producing more and more nicotine receptors. And when you're not smoking, these nicotine receptors are empty, and they don't want to be empty. Well, I'm anthropomorphizing a little bit here. They don't want anything, but they need to be filled up, basically, which is why you crave the nicotine. Interestingly, after just a few weeks of not smoking, the number of nicotine receptors goes back to normal. So you no longer have a physical addiction as such, but you still have the memory of how pleasurable the experience used to be. So you can still be psychologically addicted. So here's a brain on drugs. Here's a control. Here's methamphetamine, and someone with Parkinson's disease at the end. And you can see in this region of the brain here, there's a different level of stimulation. So prolonged drug use changes the brain in fundamental and long-lasting ways. It actually changes the number of receptors for certain neurotransmitters in the brain. The size and shape of certain regions of the brain can change in a very long-lasting way. Depends on the drug, depends on how long someone is addicted for, depends on how much of the drug they took. When we start taking a drug, drug use is voluntary. It's controlled by the frontal lobes. But after a while, it becomes compulsory, and it's deeper regions of the brain that are involved. Parts of our brain which it's very hard for us to ignore. So now let's talk a little bit about a few emotional disorders. So we'll start with anxiety disorders. They're characterized by frequent physical arousal and feelings of tension, apprehension, and worry. These include panic attacks, panic disorder, phobias, agoraphobia, social anxiety disorder, and obsessive compulsive disorder. It's all about the brain becoming overstimulated. Many people are prone to this, down to neurotransmitter levels, that kind of thing. So panic attacks, agoraphobia, and panic disorder. Agoraphobia is an intense fear of being in places from which escape is difficult. Panic attacks, an episode of extreme anxiety, fear, or terror. Panic disorder, recurring, unpredictable episodes of extreme anxiety, fear, or terror that can lead to agoraphobia, wanting to sort of stay indoors, away from all the stimulants that could basically make you anxious. By the way, sorts of people that are prone to anxiety, they like drugs that calm them down. They tend to become drawn to those. People that are overstimulated want to calm their system down, so they take depressants. Whereas people that are naturally understimulated, they want to be stimulated, so they seek out stimulant drugs to sort of raise the activity of their brains. Phobias. Characterized by a persistent irrational fear and avoidance of a specific object, activity, or situation. Social phobia is characterized by the intense fear of being embarrassed, judged, or scrutinized by others in social situations. Something that most people have to at least a very slight degree. Even if you're generally quite a calm, gregarious person in social situations, if someone asks you to give a presentation or attend a job interview, you might be more likely to be anxious in that situation. So specific phobias represent irrational fear responses to objects or situations. Anemophobia is a fear of wind. Aphiphobia, fear of being touched. Bibliophobia, fear of books, not fear of the Bible specifically. Ergophobia, fear of work. I know a few people with that one. Gamophobia, fear of marriage. Hypertrichophobia, fear of growing hair. Phonophobia, fear of the sound of your own voice. There's a phobia for everything, basically. A phobia for pretty much everything. Obsessive compulsive disorder, let's talk about that. It's quite a common disorder that people suffer from. This is when a person has recurrent obsessions and or compulsions. Obsessions, persistent, involuntary thoughts, images, or impulses that invade consciousness and cause great distress. Compulsions, persistent, irresistible, and irrational urges to perform acts or rituals repeatedly. Now, obsessive compulsive disorder can be as simple as wanting to wash your hands over and over again a certain number of times, or you fear something bad will happen. That's probably increased since the COVID pandemic, I'm guessing. But not all OCDs are outwardly visible. Some are just internal. So, for example, pure OCD, as they call it, pure O, is where you have fears of doing things. You have intrusive thoughts. For example, you might keep getting a thought in your head that you might that you may harm someone close to you, for example. And that thought just keeps coming back. What if I do a bad thing to that person? What if I do a bad thing to that person? Now, I should point out that these fears have got no basis in reality. People with pure OCD are no more likely to act on those impulses, but not impulses, I should say, those thoughts, than the rest of society. So basically, the fear that you might hurt someone doesn't mean you're going to hurt someone. In fact, the fact that you've got that fear shows that it's something you're very unlikely to do, because it fills you with fear and horror and all these negative emotions. But you can't get the thought out of your head. It comes back, what if, what if, what if? That's pure OCD. Some mood disorders. Disorders characterized by extreme and unwarranted disturbances in emotion or mood, such as major depressive disorder or bipolar disorder, where you can go from extreme sadness to extreme elation. Some people with bipolar disorder, they can spend weeks so depressed that they're suicidal, can't get out of bed, and then have a period of time where they are absolutely elated and they're full of creativity and emotion and joy. They tend to need mood stabilizers to keep them somewhere in the middle. So major depressive disorder, severe depression, sudden, no apparent external cause. Yes, depression can be caused by events in life, negative events, but sometimes it just happens. We think just due to genetics, brain chemistry, that kind of thing. Levels of certain neurotransmitters, for example, could fall too low. If your serotonin levels are too low, you will feel depressed. Bipolar disorder, a mood disorder in which manic episodes alternate with periods of depression, usually with relatively normal periods in between, although it depends. Some people can have very rapid and very recurring mood swings, so they can have them very often. Schizophrenia, a severe psychological disorder characterized by loss of contact with reality, hallucinations, auditory and visual, delusions, inappropriate or flat affect, some disturbance in thinking, social withdrawal, and other bizarre behaviors. Let's zoom in on some of these personality disorders. So, odd and eccentric. This is one category. Paranoid, schizoid, schizotypal. Dramatic, emotional or erratic, antisocial, borderline, histrionic, narcissistic. Anxiety or fearfulness, avoidant, dependent, obsessive, compulsive. Dissociative disorders. They are disorders in which, under unbearable stress, consciousness becomes dissociated from a person's identity or her or his memories of important personal events or both. You can have dissociative amnesia, a dissociative fugue, where you can find yourself in strange places and you don't know you got there. Dissociative identity disorder. Okay, so this was a very quick walkthrough. Some of the types of disorders that people can suffer from and some of the reasons why we suffer from them. Hope you've enjoyed the talk. If you want to hear more from me, then either watch my other podcasts, YouTube videos, or you can follow me on Twitter at @MarkOfTheD. And once again, if you do enjoy what I deliver, then please donate. Go to scienceontheedge.com and click on the donate button. That's all for now. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to speaking with you all again soon. Thanks for now. Goodbye.